He whispered my mother's name in his sleep. Not once, not twice, but with the trembling tenderness of a man confessing his deepest devotion. And then, before I could convince myself it was nothing more than a dream, I heard him murmur the words that turned my blood cold. I love you, Patricia. My name is Margaret Wilson, though everyone calls me Mary. I am 63 years old, a retired librarian living in Charlotte, North Carolina. For most of my adult life, I believed myself to be practical, organized, perhaps too easily content with routines. Morning tea on the porch, helping my daughter Sarah with her children on weekends, cooking Sunday meals for my husband of 40 years, David. We had what I thought was a quiet, enduring marriage. Not passionate in the way it once was, but solid, steady, familiar. I had never imagined that the greatest fracture of my life would come not from illness or death, but from betrayal so intimate it poisoned the very core of who I was. That night in late October 2023 was ordinary in every way. We had finished dinner around 7. Roast chicken, roasted carrots, and potatoes, with an apple pie I had baked earlier in the afternoon. David sat across the table, scrolling on his phone between bites, telling me briefly about a call with his old friend Tom from college who had invited him to a golf outing next month. Nothing about him betrayed even the slightest hint of what I would hear later in the darkness of our shared bedroom. He kissed my forehead before sliding into bed beside me. There was nothing unusual. His breathing slowed. His body turned to his side as always. He seemed like the same man I had slept next to for decades. But then, in the deepest part of the night, when the house was still and the street lamps spilled faint orange light through the blinds, I awoke to the sound of his voice. At first, I thought he was having a bad dream, murmuring incoherently. But then my ears sharpened in disbelief as words formed clearly. Patricia, Patricia, I love you. My mother's name. My 82-year-old mother, the woman I had cared for more intensely since my father's death 6 years ago. The woman who taught me patience, kindness, and resilience. My mother, spoken about with a tone of longing I had not heard in David's voice for me in years. I froze, my heart hammering against my ribs so violently that I could feel each pulse in the tips of my fingers. For a moment, I wondered if I was losing my mind, if perhaps the stress of aging, of managing not only my own household, but visits to my widowed mother, had warped my hearing. Yet the cadence of his whisper was undeniable, intimate, soft, a lover's voice that stripped away all illusions of ignorance. I watched him there in the moonlight, his face relaxed, untroubled by guilt in his dreams. And then a thought I could not suppress struck me. How often had he dreamed of her like this, while lying in our bed beside me? By morning, I dismissed the idea of confronting him outright. If there was one thing life had taught me, it was that truth does not unravel easily when demanded. It must be coaxed out, uncovered, built piece by piece until denial becomes impossible. Instead, I poured his coffee like I always did, buttered his toast, and asked about his day. My eyes no doubt betrayed the storm beneath the surface, but David seemed oblivious, talking casually about picking up the dry cleaning on his way home from golf practice. When he left, I stood for a long time at the kitchen window, staring at our quiet street, wondering if my entire marriage had been a carefully constructed performance. Consumed by doubt, I went to his phone, which he had carelessly left in the living room charging. My hands shook as I entered the passcode, the same one he had never thought to change over the years. At first, everything looked ordinary. Calendar reminders for business lunches, notes about golf handicaps, photos of Sarah's 2 little boys from last Thanksgiving. But then, buried in his messaging app, a thread of conversations under the simple name Patricia, my mother's number. My lips parted in mute horror as I scrolled. Hundreds, no, thousands of messages sat there, each wrapped in the intimacy I had starved for in my own marriage. Pleas about secrecy. Your daughter can never know. Compliments written late at night. You're the only one who understands me. And worst of all, words that mocked me, even as they caressed her. Being around her makes it hard sometimes, but when we're alone, it all feels worth it. I found messages dated back at least 2 years. Mentions of lunches they had shared after her doctor appointments. Notes about my mother inviting him in when Mary was running late. Even small digital hearts left on seemingly innocent photos she'd texted him of her garden. A garden I had helped her tend countless afternoons. My knees nearly gave way. I sat on the sofa staring at the screen, incapable of tears just yet. What I felt was deeper than crying. It was a destabilization of everything that had come before, an earthquake of family trust. My husband and my mother, the two people who had shaped the safety of my daily existence, were bound together in layers of secrecy. As the day crept on and shadows lengthened in our home, I thought of Sarah. My daughter adored her grandmother, confided in her, let her babysit the boys nearly every week. To imagine what these revelations would do to her trust was unbearable. She worshipped the ground Patricia walked on, and to uncover such a betrayal would devastate her. Yet as much as it tore me apart, I also knew silence was complicity, and complicity was something I could no longer afford. The rest of that day I went about quietly, cooking dinner, folding laundry, pretending life remained unbroken. Inside, however, a decision formed, not rash, not yet spoken, but rooted in something I had not felt in a long time. The resolve to confront truth with dignity, no matter how deeply it shattered the illusion of family we all depended on. That night, when David returned from his so-called golf practice, he kissed me goodnight with a smile. I returned the gesture, my face serene, though my hands trembled under the covers. I had entered a new chapter of life, one bound not by routine comfort, but by discovery, strategy, and a painful search for justice within my own home. I understood, in that moment, that nothing could ever be the same again. This was the beginning of the end, and I would ensure it ended not just with betrayal, but with my truth. The morning after I found those threads of messages, my world seemed outwardly unchanged. The mail still arrived at 10. Sarah still called to ask if I could pick up her boys from school on Friday, and my husband still left the house in his worn golf jacket, humming as he jingled his keys. But behind the steady rhythm of routine, inside of me, there was an unshakable transformation. The simplest act, placing his coffee on the table, felt staged, like I was playing a role in a drama that had already collapsed backstage. I knew I could not break that facade yet. David believed he had me fooled, and so did my mother. That obliviousness was my currency now. I would not shout, I would not throw objects, I would not sob in front of him. I had to become the observer, the woman who pretended to move as before, while recording every stumble, every slip, every piece of evidence. The first step was memory. My mind walked backward through the last few years with a new lens. I suddenly remembered family gatherings where Patricia and David lingered in the kitchen long after everyone had drifted to the living room. At the time, I thought nothing of it. My mother was spirited and talkative, and David, though less expressive, humored her often. Now those moments flickered in my mind differently. The way he sometimes carried her coat to the car, his hand brushing hers deliberately. How she laughed louder at his jokes than mine, though they were hardly funny. How Sarah once teased, "Grandma, you and Dad act like best friends." And we all laughed while my mother's cheeks gave off a faint shade of rose. Those memories spiraled into a sharp realization. I had missed what was directly in front of me. Not through stupidity, but through trust. Trust had been my blindfold. I returned to his phone the next day, pretending to search for Sarah's photos from last week. Instead, I scrolled deeper through conversations that stretched back not months, but years. The earliest messages I uncovered connected to 2021. Short notes, disguised at first as coordination about helping my mother with errands. "Can you drive me to the store? Mary will be busy." Then, growing warmer, "You looked beautiful today at dinner." By the spring of 2022, there was no more disguising. "I can't stop thinking about the feel of your hand when we passed dishes." Every new detail was a hammer to my chest. I printed some screenshots quietly on the downstairs printer, slipping the papers inside a folder I locked in my desk. My fingers trembled as I handled them. the black letters against white paper more sickening than any nightmare. But evidence alone could not build a full story. I needed patterns. I started keeping my own logbook, a plain notebook I had once used for grocery lists. Every time David claimed to be out, golf lessons, hardware store runs, late errands, I recorded the date, time, and excuse. I compared these notes with texts in his phone when I gained the chance. The overlaps were undeniable. He once told me he was fixing a leak in the basement bathroom at Home Depot. But during those same hours he texted Patricia, "I'll pick up lunch for us. Don't let Mary suspect." I felt myself splitting, outwardly calm, inwardly consumed. I still brought my mother her groceries each week, sat with her through her Medicare checkups, walked around her living room adjusting her thermostat when she complained of drafts. Now, however, I scrutinized her. Did her eyes sparkle when she mentioned David's name? Once she sighed and said, "David has been so helpful pushing the trash bins out when you're late. What would I do without him?" That casual line made my stomach knot so violently that I excused myself to the bathroom just to steady my breathing. And yet, alongside the fury, there was grief, unlike anything I had carried before. The betrayal was doubled. Two people bound to me by vows of loyalty and blood. That agonizing duality gnawed at me. One moment shame, the next rising anger, then sorrow, then ice-cold determination. The hardest nights were when Sarah called, asking if Grandma could watch the boys. I forced a cheerful voice, granting permission, while picturing the little ones laughing in Patricia's kitchen, utterly unaware of the poisoned undercurrent around them. I began to think of Sarah not just as my daughter, but as someone whose trust I would one day have to crush with this truth. That knowledge made me ache more than anything. To strengthen my resolve, I leaned on habits of order, the librarian's instinct within me. I scanned receipts left in David's pockets, finding dinners for two at restaurants he never mentioned. I organized printouts of messages by date, labeling them with categories: affection, coordination, secrets. There were hundreds. Examining them felt like digging up bones of a body I had once assumed was whole, but that had in fact rotted beneath me for years. But through this slow, methodical pain, I built clarity. I recognized that David and Patricia had not simply made a brief mistake. This was not an impulsive slip. It was sustained, calculated, layered beneath lie after lie. My investigation was not just about uncovering facts. It was about preparing myself for the moment when nothing could be denied. At night, I began locking my folder behind the old chest in the guest room, beneath folded quilts. Every addition to that growing archive was another stroke of armor. I told myself, these are not just messages. These are proof of reality in a world that now tried to gaslight me into silence. If anyone ever doubted, I would have the evidence. And still, outwardly, I remained gentle, routine. I cooked soup on Sundays when Sarah visited with the kids. I let David kiss my cheek before he left for golf practice. I sat across from Patricia at her kitchen table while she asked if I needed more flour for my pie recipes. Every word from their mouths was another thorn, yet I made myself bleed silently for now. In those weeks I learned something vital. Silence is not weakness. Sometimes silence is the cage where a storm gathers before it breaks. And in me, the storm was only beginning. The weeks following my quiet discovery unfolded like a play in which I alone knew the ending. Each gesture, each conversation existed in two dimensions, the visible routine and the hidden truth beneath. Carrying this duplicity demanded an agility I hadn't known I possessed. Yet with every message tucked into my file, with every detail logged into my notebook, I understood there would come a time when silence would no longer serve me. Silent observation had sharpened the outlines of betrayal, but strategy was required if I hoped to walk away intact. The first nights were always the hardest. After putting down my pen and hiding the notebook in the bottom drawer, I would crawl into bed beside David and curl away from him, letting tears soak into my pillow unseen. At 63, I never imagined I would be revisiting the loneliness of my 20s, crying quietly in the dark while the man I loved slept peacefully. The anguish often left me trembling. But just as quickly, I transformed anguish into calculation. Rage is fire, yes, but directed properly, it can be a forge. I began by studying my financial situation, something David often insisted on controlling throughout our marriage. Though I had once yielded to his confidence, I now realized that ignorance was liability. So, in daylight hours when he was gone, I organized our bank statements from the past 3 years. Receipts, tucked carelessly into drawers, were matched with digital payments. To my horror, I saw transfers he had hidden, amounts not devastating individually, but together revealing a pattern of siphoning. 200 here, 500 there, often coinciding with my mother's doctor's visits or so-called social lunches. I opened a new checking account in my name only at First Federal Bank, careful not to draw suspicion. Into this account, I transferred small drips of my own personal savings left over from freelance cataloging projects and tutoring jobs I had done after retirement. It was not much, about $8,000, but it was mine, traced entirely back to efforts David never noticed. At the same time, I quietly began photographing everything of value within our home. Antique lamps inherited from my grandmother, jewelry my father had gifted me before he passed, even the old armoire that had belonged to my great-aunt. Each image was catalogued and copied onto a flash drive, then stored in a safety deposit box I rented under my name. It occurred to me that if the truth ignited in open flame, David might try to diminish my stability out of spite. Documenting what had always been mine became insurance against such vindictiveness, but paperwork alone was insufficient. I needed voices beyond my own thoughts. One chilly morning, hands still trembling from lack of sleep, I drove to a therapist recommended by Sarah months ago when I had complained of fatigue. Dr. Ellen Matthews, a petite woman with gentle eyes behind thick frames, welcomed me with such quiet warmth that my defenses cracked. For nearly half an hour, I said nothing, merely sat breathing shakily as she waited. When I finally spoke, words tumbled with rawness. My husband has been unfaithful with my mother. Dr. Matthews didn't flinch. She did not press for sordid details immediately, but guided me calmly, reminding me that pain doesn't disappear through planning alone. It demands acknowledgement, grief, even mourning the imagined life I'd believed was true. With her, I allowed vulnerability space. Tears blurred my vision in ways I refused to permit at home. And yet, even in that room scented faintly of lavender, I also outlined my determination. She nodded, affirming my instinct. The importance of preserving dignity, building a scaffold of support before any confrontation. Spurred by her counsel, I made a legal appointment with Catherine Douglas, a family attorney recommended discreetly by a friend from my book club. I carried a folder stuffed with printouts, receipts, transcripted notes from David's phone. Catherine read silently for long minutes, her brows drawing together. "This isn't merely marital infidelity," she finally said, tapping her pen against the papers. "These correspondences prove long-term misconduct. If you choose divorce or separation, these records protect you from claims or manipulations. Do not confront him without a plan. We'll begin by marking your assets clearly apart from his. If needed, we'll apply for protective orders to keep your funds secure." The steadiness in her professionalism settled something in me. Here at last was an external witness to my reality, someone grounding the chaos in language of statutes and case law. It gave me perspective. My life hadn't dissolved into madness. What I faced had contours recognizable even to the law. After that meeting, walking to my car under the pale November sky, I felt a new kind of strength. Not joy, not relief, but clarity. Steps could be taken, a path could be walked. Still, there remained the question of Sarah. In every moment of planning, her face appeared to me. The daughter who still sought her grandmother's help with recipes, who let David teach her sons how to fish during summer weekends. How could I taint her childhood heroes? How could I shatter her notion of family stability? And yet, how cruel would it be to allow lies to govern her trust? For now, I held my breath on this matter. Logic whispered, timing matters. Premature disclosure might only wound without purpose. Strategy required patience. In her innocence of the secret, Sarah was safe a little longer, while I built the walls necessary to withstand the storm. The paradox of those weeks was that my exterior life retained its absolute normalcy. Me attending church on Sundays, cooking simple dinners, calling my mother to check on her prescriptions. And yet, beneath that surface, every act was recalibration. My mother's laugh over the phone felt rehearsed, tinged with suspicion in my ears. When she mentioned David bringing by groceries so helpfully, I took note in my log, another thread in the pattern. David himself remained oblivious, slipping into bed with casual conversation, offering passing remarks about local news or the football game. He thought he was undisturbed, still hidden. But I no longer looked at him as the man beside me. I watched him as one would study an adversary, taking in detail after detail. In the stillness of pre-dawn, file folder secured, notebook updated, I often whispered to myself, I am not broken. I am preparing. These words became my shield. For all the tears, for all the shattered trust, for all the nights when grief threatened to swallow me whole, I never forgot. In silence, I was collecting not despair, but leverage. Strategy was my salvation. And strategy was what would lead me to the moment where truth erupted, not haphazardly, not wildly, but in my terms, with my evidence, my plan, and my future already defended. In this concealed theater I had begun directing, every choice was deliberate. I had become both archivist and tactician, recording the betrayals of others while building the blueprint for my own escape. By the second week of November 2023, the quiet accumulation of evidence shifted into action. My days no longer revolved around suspicion. They revolved around preparation. It became less about surviving each revelation and more about positioning myself to withstand the eventual collapse of everything I had once called family. Strategy, once an abstract comfort, now became tangible steps, small decisions, careful moves, discreet protections that no one around me noticed. Each morning, I moved through my ordinary ritual. Tea steeping, curtains drawn open to the neighborhood trees dropping their leaves, while internally rehearsing the choreography of what I needed to do. My face reflected calm, but beneath my skin, resolve ran like current through a buried wire. The first concrete step was financial protection. Following Catherine's counsel, I began transferring modest sums of my personal funds into that separate account, never more than $200 or $300 at a time, spread across days, keeping movement subtle and unremarkable on joint statements. I visited the bank twice in 1 week, under the pretense of updating information for my retirement distributions. The teller, unaware of the drama beneath my smile, processed the forms while I thought, this is how I secure the ground under my feet. Simultaneously, I rented a small storage unit on the edge of Charlotte, telling the clerk it was for storing my late father's books, which I claimed I couldn't quite part with. Into that windowless space, I began ferrying items that carried irreplaceable meaning. Jewelry my father gave me on my 40th birthday, porcelain bowls belonging to my grandmother, framed photos I didn't trust to leave vulnerable in our house once confrontation exploded. I worked in silence, wrapping items in towels, boxing them, labeling them with misleading words like holiday decor to deflect suspicion if discovered. Every trip to that unit strengthened me with a strange comfort. Even in destruction, I would have remnants intact. At home, interactions required poise. Patricia still called me in the mornings, updating me about her aches, her grocery needs, or reminding me of prescription refills. Some days I nearly choked on the venom her voice induced. Yet I remained composed, jotting notes in my log about her phrasing. Occasionally she let slip small hints. David checked on me yesterday when you were busy, such a help. My pen would press heavily into the page as I wrote, Wednesday, 2:15 p.m., visited Patricia without mentioning it to me. I realized then what contempt fuels duplicity. They had built a companionship in the shadows, behaving as if I were too dim to notice, weaving their pretense over years of casual deceit. Understanding that arrogance gave me sharper clarity. It made planning easier because I saw how blind they both were to my awakening. But there remained Sarah. By then, my daughter's presence had become unbearable to me in its innocence. She laughed with David, dropped the boys at my mother's without hesitation, sometimes even joked, "I hope I'm still as close to Dad and Grandma when I'm 70. Each word stabbed. I carried the knowledge like acid in my stomach. At night, after updating my files and confirming my financial motions were secure, I sat shaking, thinking, how can I tell her? When? And how do I shield her sons from scorched family ground? The answer came quietly. One Saturday afternoon, after picking up groceries, I invited Sarah for coffee. We sat in my kitchen while David mumbled upstairs about checking emails. My heart thundered, but I measured my words, careful not to rush. "Sarah," I began, voice low, "your father has been deceiving me, and worse, it involves your grandmother." Her laugh was instant, startled, disbelieving. "Mom, what? Grandma?" I slid the folder across the table, screenshots bound together, receipts signed in his name beside hers. Messages with my mother's phone number displayed unmistakably. Sarah's fingers stiffened as she read. Her lips parted, then closed, then pressed tight. She didn't cry. Her face hardened in a way I had never seen before. "This can't be real!" But her voice cracked, betraying recognition. Evidence doesn't flinch. It simply exists. Her eyes lifted to mine, blazing with recognition of betrayal, not just against me, but against her as well. "You've been carrying this?" I nodded. "For weeks. I needed time to prepare. I couldn't let them ruin me without plan." She placed her hand atop mine, her grip trembling. "I'm with you, Mom. Tell me what you need me to do." That night, I felt both heartbreak and relief. In confiding with Sarah, I had shared the unbearable burden, yet I had also shattered a daughter's innocence. Watching her retreat into silence that evening, barely saying goodbye before driving away, left me sick with guilt. But the truth had its own timetable. It released me from solitary watch, even if it wounded her deeply. In the following days, my preparations accelerated. I drafted a written list of confrontation conditions: the when, the where, the who. Thanksgiving loomed on the calendar, a table always reserved for togetherness, the one day in the year where generations gathered. The irony of that image struck me. The day of harvest celebration would become harvest of secrets. Still, I moved cautiously, checking my copies of evidence, ensuring valuables were secured, monitoring my accounts daily for any sudden withdrawals. David remained oblivious. His nightly routine continued unchanged. Television murmuring in the background, casual discussion of weather predictions, the familiar sigh as he drifted into sleep. Twice more, I heard him murmur my mother's name unconsciously. Each time felt like a dagger carving deeper. But now I captured it in my journal, another notch on the ledger of betrayal. Patricia's demeanor, too, remained unchanged. She phoned Sarah with reminders about the boys' soccer games, baked cookies she offered to share at supper the following weekend, laughed about recipes. But Sarah now looked at her with new eyes. Though she hadn't spoken outright, I watched distance form each time her grandmother called. The most striking realization during those tense weeks was that my silence had transformed me. Before, I had been merely a wounded wife. Now I was strategist, executor, protector. Every pen stroke on evidence, every discreet banking shift, every staged smile at dinner was step closer to liberation. I often sat in the car parked outside that storage unit, breathing in the cold November air, telling myself, I have already survived the worst discovery. What remains is execution. To carry this truth into the open, to end the deception on my terms. And so I waited, patient, meticulous, determined. Each move deliberately small, but with cumulative strength. Thanksgiving Day approached like a stage curtain rising, and in my heart I knew the role I would play was no longer that of the dutiful wife or the dutiful daughter. It would be the role of the woman who chose truth, who would rather burn bridges than live blindfolded. The storm had ripened, and soon it would break. Thanksgiving morning in November of 2023 rose gray and still. Outside, the sky brooded with low clouds, and the brittle trees in our Charlotte neighborhood stood like bare sentinels. I moved through the kitchen early, setting out plates and polishing serving spoons with steady hands. On the surface, everything looked as it had for years: turkey defrosting in the sink, pies cooling on the counter, potatoes waiting to be mashed. But beneath those familiar details, tension coiled in my chest like a wire pulled taut. This day I had chosen for revelation, and no ritual could soften what was about to unfold. David came downstairs later than usual, rubbing his eyes, humming softly, still unaware of how close his carefully hidden lies had come to unraveling. "Morning," he said, pressing a kiss against my cheek, the way husbands do when convinced their marriages remain whole. His casual affection met a wall of steel inside me. I answered with the same smile I'd perfected in recent weeks, masking the storm behind my ribs. By noon, Sarah arrived with the boys, their laughter filling the front hall as they shrugged off jackets. She met my eyes briefly, silently acknowledging the unbearable secret we held between us. Patricia came moments later. My mother's perfume preceded her as always, the lavender scent curling through the doorway, still oddly comforting, even as it turned my stomach with betrayal. She embraced me warmly, as though nothing beneath her skin hid shame or duplicity. Watching her kiss my cheek as the grandchildren tugged her sleeves, bile rose in my throat. We ate in stages, appetizers first, casual chatter about football games running on television, my grandsons sparring with toy cars on the living room carpet. David carved the turkey with practiced skill, telling a well-worn story about the year he had burned a bird during our early marriage, drawing laughter from Patricia as though the memory belonged intimately to the two of them. I held my tongue, my hand tightening around my fork. Sarah sat stiff at the table, polite but unusually quiet. Each passing moment pressed the secret heavier on our shoulders. Dessert plates clinked onto the table: apple pie with ice cream, pumpkin pie with whipped cream, coffee brewed, steam curling from mugs. Conversation dulled into the post-feast calm, and I knew it was time. My heartbeat quickened until I thought the others could hear it. I rose, went to the sideboard drawer, and returned holding the folder that had become both weapon and shield. "I need everyone to listen," I said evenly, though my voice cut through the room, sharp as glass. My gaze swept over David, then my mother, then Sarah and the children. "There are truths sitting in this family that I can no longer carry alone." David frowned, uncomfortable already. "Mary, can this wait? The boys?" "No, not anymore." My words were iron. I placed the folder on the table with finality. "For weeks, I've been collecting proof of what you, David, and you, Mother, have been hiding. And tonight, before another holiday meal poisons itself with lies, it ends." Patricia's hand froze against her coffee cup. David reached instinctively for the folder. I stopped him with a glare. "Read," I commanded, sliding the stack of printed messages into the center. "But do not tell me I've misunderstood. Do not insult me with denials." Sarah's face flinched as the evidence she had already seen now lay exposed under fluorescent dining room light. David's eyes scanned desperately, the screenshots of midnight confessions, affectionate emoticons, phrases about secrecy. "She can never know." His lips moved, but produced no sound. Finally he muttered, "This isn't what it looks like." "What it looks like," I cut him off, voice rising for the first time, "is you whispering love to my mother, arranging meetings behind my back, mocking me with the intimacy I thought was ours. What it looks like is years of betrayal wrapped inside family gatherings." Patricia spoke then, her voice quivering but not silent. "Mary, please, I never meant for—" "You never meant?" Rage surged through decades of loyalty spent. "I trusted you both. You were the two people in my world bound most tightly to me, and you turned that bond into something filthy." My mother shook her head, eyes moist. "It wasn't like that. I was lonely ever since your father passed. I didn't plan any of this. It was companionship. Then it became—" She broke off, choking on her own words. companionship. As if companionship excused the rot of secrecy. Sarah slammed her fork to the table. The sharp crack startled the children into silence. Her voice trembled with fury. "I can't listen to this. I brought my children here for tradition, not this nightmare." She shoved back her chair, guiding the boys quickly from the room. "You've destroyed any respect I had left, Grandma, and you, Dad, I can't even look at you." Doors banged as she left. The silence that followed was suffocating. David finally leaned forward, desperation carving his features. "Mary, please, we can fix this. It was never meant to hurt you." I laughed then, not from mirth, but from the raw hollowness of a heart exhausted. "Not meant to hurt me? You built your little secret on my blindness, assuming I'd never notice. I heard your whispers in the night, David. I saw your messages, Mother. And you still thought me too simple to see." Their faces reflected twin masks of ruin, guilt, fear, shame, calculation. But I no longer trembled before them. I rose from my chair and gathered the folder in my arms. "You have burned this family at its center. From this day forward, I am done protecting you with silence. Sarah will decide what role, if any, she'll grant you near her children. As for me, consider me finished." Without another glance, I walked from that dining room, the echoes of betrayal ringing behind me. The turkey, the pies, the polished silver, all meaningless now, stage props for a confrontation decades in the making. As I stepped into the cold November air, crisp wind snagging the edge of my scarf, I felt the strangest weightlessness. The devastation had torn through that house, but I had finally wrested truth out of secrecy. Thanksgiving had become the day not of family unity, but of unveiling, and I walked into the night knowing there could be no return to the world that existed before. I had broken the silence. The reckoning had begun. December came cold that year in Charlotte. The trees that had displayed fiery bursts of red and gold now stood skeletal against a stark, flat sky. After Thanksgiving erupted in truth, my house was eerily quiet, carrying an emptiness that was both suffocating and strangely freeing. I no longer had to pretend, not in my own rooms, not in my own bed, not in front of people who had already betrayed every vow and bond that should have safeguarded me. The silence that followed the explosion of revelation was devastating, but it was also the beginning of my reclamation. David moved out within days of the confrontation. He didn't argue when I demanded it, didn't try to charm his way back into my good graces the way I once half expected. His eyes were hollow when he packed his bags, as if he already knew the consequences were set in stone. His departure was quiet, just the thud of boxes being carried to his car, the sound of the garage door creaking one last time as he pulled away. That night I lay in bed alone, the emptiness beside me as cavernous as the void he had carved into my life long before physically leaving. Patricia, my mother, my betrayer, my blood, was a different matter. She called 3 times in the days after Thanksgiving. The first time she left a message, her voice strained but oddly tender. "Mary, please. Don't shut me out. I never wanted to lose you." I deleted it before the end. The second time she tried again. It was a weakness. I was lonely. I didn't think it could. I hung up halfway through. By the third attempt, her number itself was blocked. Whatever she wanted to explain, no words could cleanse the rot of her actions. The hardest part was Sarah. In the storm that blasted open our lives during that Thanksgiving dinner, she had left with fury in her veins, shielding her children, casting both her father and grandmother into silence. But beneath that fire sparkled vulnerability. A week later, she came by, the boys tugging at her coat as she entered, their chatter a shield against the heavy air between us. She sent them to the living room with toys before sitting at my table. Her face was pale, eyes rimmed in red from too many sleepless nights. "Mom," she said softly, "I can't understand how the people I trusted most could be so reckless, so cruel." Tears welled uninvited. "But I need you to know, I believe you, I don't blame you, and I won't let them have space around my children ever again." Relief flooded me in that moment. unexpected and overwhelming. I grasped her hand across the table, our grip tight, like survivors clinging to driftwood after a wreck. For all that was torn beyond repair, I had not lost my daughter. That was enough to keep a flame alive within me. As legal matters followed, Catherine, my attorney, guided me systematically. She filed for formal separation, safeguarding what assets were mine alone, ensuring David's missteps would not consume me financially. To the outside world, people may have muttered, neighbors may have speculated, but the paperwork, clinical and factual, became the tool of my liberation. Where deceit had entangled me, law placed lines of protection. Yet the legal walls were not what gave me true solace. Solace arrived in the quieter daily victories. The mornings I woke without the dread of what I might overhear next to me in bed. Afternoons I brewed tea and realized the house finally belonged only to me. Evenings I spoke with Sarah and heard in her voice the echo of respect, unshaken by the shame her father and grandmother had earned. Grief did not vanish. It came in waves, at Christmas, when old traditions lay discarded because the family we once were no longer existed. On New Year's Eve, when I considered the empty decades behind me, built on loyalty that was not mutual. On ordinary afternoons, when I spotted lavender perfume in a store and remembered my mother's scent, now forever polluted by secrecy. But grief is not endless. It changes shape. With time, mine became less a choking vine and more a scar, tender to touch, but not fatal. I began seeing Dr. Matthews weekly again. In her office, I learned to release the idea that my worth was tied to a marriage certificate or a parent's approval. Your freedom, she told me, is born not from what they did, but from the fact that you chose to see clearly, to act, to preserve yourself. I clung to those words. Each session, I walked out into the winter air feeling a little more whole. Ironically, despite decades of being underestimated, I emerged stronger by choosing confrontation on my terms. My father had once told me, years before dementia clouded his mind, that the truth always wins in the end. Sometimes it burns everything down, but what rises from ashes is far sturdier than what looked perfect on the surface. I understood his wisdom now. By spring, Sarah and I had built new traditions with her children. We hosted small Sunday brunches, laughter echoing through my kitchen as the boys fought over pancake shapes. David's absence was heavy, yes, but not unbearable. Patricia's presence was gone forever, and for that, I felt only clarity. Where others once took up space with lies, there grew room for light. Now, months later, at 63, I look at my reflection differently. Not as the woman who was betrayed by the two people closest to her, but as the woman who refused to drown in their betrayal. I recognize the wrinkles around my eyes, etched deeper by sorrow, but I also see the steadiness in my gaze, sharpened by survival. The truth left scars across my life, scars shaped like empty chairs at dinner tables, unanswered phone calls, photographs consigned to drawers I no longer open. But those scars are proof that I did not collapse. I endured. I acted. I chose dignity over silence. This, I realize now, is what it means to reclaim yourself, not erasing the devastation, but carrying it, learning from it, and refusing to be defined by the cruelty of others. My husband's betrayal and my mother's duplicity might always mark me, but they no longer own me. I own my future, and that is enough.